Lord of the Rings, To Pimp a Butterfly, Joni Mitchell's Blue, and all the other great works that you see on the screen here. What do these great pieces of art and the original thinkers that sit behind them all share in common? When I set out to write a video that addressed that age-old question, where do driving ideas and original projects like these actually come from? I started to realise that there was an underlying thread that I could pick through all these pieces of work I was looking at. I'm not trying to bury the lead on you here, but in order to demonstrate clearly what I'm trying to talk about in this video, allow me to start with a succinct story.
Songs are like tattoos. You know I've been to see.
This is a cruciform building in central London, now a university teaching block but previously a hospital. It's the place where in 1950, at the age of just 46, George Orwell died. It was tuberculosis, a disease that, if he'd shown some more care for his own health in the years prior, had a good chance of being treated. Instead, Orwell had been living on the remote island of Jura, smoking rolled up cigarettes full of heavy pipe tobacco, and using sheets of old newspaper when he couldn't find anything else. The focus had been the writing and finishing his last book, 1984. The ideas contained in this book would be burned into culture and seemed to grow in prescience as time passed. But how does someone become so motivated by a project that they're happy to put above everything else, including their rapidly declining health? It's often said that motivation like this comes from talent bestowed on certain people and not others, but I don't think that's true. To me, the strength of concept and thought in 1984 is a symptom of something more simple: Orwell's direct experience. In his earlier non-fiction work, Homage to Catalonia, Orwell writes about his time abroad, volunteering to fight against the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. A totalitarian regime, a fight for humanity over ideology, a focus on propaganda and the control of information. The underlying similarities between these two works all sound pretty familiar. And for the central point, allow me to take one more step into the weeds here. Orwell's original title for 1984 was The Last Man in Europe, and although the book is a cry against totalitarian control, the real soul and strength of the idea lies in the specific story of the main character, Winston, who feels he might be the only real example of humanity left. Here we travel back in time again to that younger Orwell, who, unlike many of the prestigious literary, political or moral figures of his time, deposed the ideological ideas of Stalinism as a central point in the war against fascists. In his denouncement of Stalinism, Orwell would ostracise himself and block his writing from wider anti-fascist readership. What I'm getting at here is the isolation of 1984's Winston, attempting to hold a path of basic humanity in a world overtaken by totalitarian ideologies on all sides, isn't some kind of thought experiment. This was Orwell's lived experience, and when we read 1984, we can hear something of the quality and necessity with which Orwell wants to communicate these ideas, burnt deeply into that writing at the level of every sentence. At the end of this video, I'm going to be turning back to Orwell to bring his example together with other artists and talk about how we can push for such a high standard of not only just thinking, but creative independence. I'm going to be putting down a bit of an argument here about how all kinds of creatives can place lived experience at the heart of their practice. I won't have time to speak about the painter, who asked to be tied to a ship's mast to better understand the storms which were his subject matter, or the film director, who walked on foot from Munich to Paris and still tells budding film students, walk 1,000 miles, it's much more worth it than 3 years in film school.
When a friend of mine called from Paris, come quickly, she's dying. And for a moment I didn't know what to do. It was such a deep shock, and something surged inside of me, and I knew, you're not going to fly to Paris, you are going to walk.
I say this not only to put importance on the usefulness of this topic, but also to make it clear that I'm not suggesting there's a full treatment here. And I hope my small discussion will act to open up your own ideas, conversations, and possibilities for the future direction of your work.
painter. I live in a box of paints.
Throughout this video, I will be undertaking my own short trip that you'll see referenced a few times. I tell a lot of more epic stories of artists' experience and travel in this piece, so I hope my journey will also demonstrate the more manageable paths that we can take. My goal when you watch these videos is that you recognise the care, time investment and creative sensitivity that goes into making them. I ask as usual then, that those who are getting some value here and can afford the price of a coffee per month considers coming over and checking out the Patreon or Substack paid channel. I'm trying to construct an offer of more exclusive work that will make the supporters there feel valued and allow me to create a sustainable engine to push the free YouTube resources forwards. And yeah, if you're listening to this and you are already signed up there, this is an important note within the video to celebrate your contribution and support for this work that people are enjoying and getting value from. And with that said, let's get into it.
Part 1. Finding the river and following it.
Have you ever felt stuck in your work, struggling to pick the right projects, or find yourself in a cycle of making the same kinds of things over and over again and getting similar results? These kind of ruts can be disempowering for artists, and the indecision can often mess with the passion that they found in their work at the start. But when we feel that creative rut or indecision, there are other things that we can do. When cult illustrator Jean Girard returned to art school in Paris with a new perspective, something that would come to define his approach to the industry and the power and uniqueness of all his work that followed. What was it exactly that had risen him from the more mundane or cyclical work of his previous student days? When I started writing this script, I already knew this story about Jean Girard or Mobius, and I realised quite quickly that it was one I wanted to tell here. His futuristic visions are some of my favourite illustrated works, and within them lie his own story of how lived experience and specifically travel influenced him. So what exactly happened to that young art student to set him on his way such a unique career? When Girard's mother moved to Mexico to marry, he paid his way out there to spend the summer with her and ended up forming a relationship with the Mexican desert that would feed his work so deeply later on. Crossing the desert was a sort of initiation, he says of his journeys there. Hours and hours of flat terrain, brilliant sunshine, interminable blue, a white hot sky. It was magnificent. It was something that really cracked open my soul. After returning to the safer harbours of Paris, Jean Girard had brought his alter ego Mobius along with him, and from then on, his work would contain that magic of the desert landscapes and deep introspection into the unconscious soul that he'd discovered. I wouldn't blame people for thinking here that everything that I'm saying so far isn't massively radical, and that link between lived experience and creative work is something that's been drawn many times before. But before we leave these ideas of the safe harbours that might suffocate our work, I wanted to point out some more subtle or insidious factors that we might recognise here. This deep call inside us for safe and knowable harbours might not just be holding us in stagnation, but linked to deeper ideas around perfectionism and a sense of purity.
We were going to save money and then go someplace where costs were very cheap, in this case Mexico, and then sit down there and write the perfect book. We hitchhiked all the way down through Nevada into Southern California, across Arizona, down into Mexico, and in Acayucan we got paper and I bought a Parker 51 pen, and at the end of a week I still hadn't written anything. And I began to become gradually aware everything I had set up, everything I had done to come down here wasn't right. It was a wrong situation. I was doing it badly.
Persic describes perfectly for us the failure of what it's like to search for that perfect spot to sit down and write your masterpiece. Here we find one of the quieter lies that can close us off from the real experience that most powerful and great art is going to have to deal with. The need perhaps for everything to be just right before you start practicing that instrument. or the point of the pencil to be a little bit thinner before you place it down on that canvas. It was Robert Pirsig's second book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, that would actually bring forth his original perspective and deep drive to express himself. So how can we differentiate the conditions and foundation of that later creative practice?
I'd been a teacher, gotten involved with some very difficult, complex ideas about quality, and as a result, wound up in a mental hospital. And after I'd come out of the mental hospital, was ineligible for teaching work. I became a technical writer and worked very hard at this and tried to employ some of the ideas I'd had before the breakdown into the work I'd been doing. Sitting at an office over in control data, overloaded, but kind of happy about a motorcycle I had that I just fixed, I started to daydream in the office and said, gee, I wish I could do a little essay on how I fixed the motorcycle and how that's not so very different from the abstract ideas of art or the religious ideas of Zen. The thing I want to emphasize is that when that idea came, there was no preparation for it. It arrived out of my own circumstances rather than out of a deliberate desire on my part to sit down and write. I wasn't being separate from what I was doing. This was arising out of what I was doing.
Part 2. On limitations, independence, and mud.
Pilgrimage, road trips, and other stories of movement and travel are linked deep within a lot of human cultures to ideas around epiphany. When we look at stories of experiences and journeys, we can see that they can open up our ability to access information, find new parts of ourselves, and allow important knowledge to float up from the deep. Many writers, artists, creatives of all types have talked about how being on the road has informed their work. A Handmaid's Tale, like Orwell's 1984 that we spoke about earlier, is a book that's driving ideas, set the stage for the clarity and power of every single sentence. Referring to her writing journal at the time, Margaret Atwood describes how the book was written whilst living in West Berlin, a place still encircled by the Berlin Wall. Atwood is a greatly prolific writer who has created all kinds of driven fiction in her work, but maybe it's in this bout of writing, whilst living so deeply buried in the themes of control and human sublimation on which the book sits, that's created her most widely resonant and powerful piece of work.
I'd been putting off The Handmaid's Tale. It seemed like such a far-fetched idea and likely to get me in trouble. Some people wouldn't love it. But despite my misgivings, The Handmaid's Tale was clamoring to be written, so I plunged in using a rented German typewriter, since I was now living in West Berlin with the Cold War going on all around me. That too was inspirational. I finished the book in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a year later. Inspirational too, in its own way. How long did it take you to write The Handmaid's Tale, I am sometimes asked. It may look like only a year, but the real answer is 4,000 years, because that's how much of women's history I was drawing on, and that's how many generations of storytellers stood behind me.
Just like Orwell, again we can see how Atwood's most powerful creative product would be based on some of her deepest personal experience and convictions, and that it would be by escaping the limitations of her everyday environment that would allow this work to be realised onto the page.
So how do you keep speaking up? Well, I don't know. I've been doing that since the late 60s, and every time, of course, that you appear in public in any way, somebody's going to attack you. There was a great piece on Mary Beard recently in which she talked about the tradition that those who speak in public have for the last 3,000 years or so been men. So if you are not a man and you say just about anything in public, you're going to get a certain onslaught. And if Mary Beard can deal with that, so can I.
So far I've mostly discussed physical journeys, but I wanted to pull in other ways that we can move out of those safe harbours too.
This is a Radiohead. Anyway.
I'll admit that I've been kind of looking for an excuse to talk about Radiohead on this channel for some time now. This is a collection of musicians that seem to naturally push the form and style of their work with every project. From starting off in the bracket of an early 90s British pop rock band, they pushed their form into the more experimental song structures and aesthetics of OK Computer, then found more space in development with the electronically driven Kid A. I could go on to discuss their individual work and all the other experiments that they've taken along the way, but the principle here is to recognise the ability to travel in genre and form as another way that we can break out of habit and secular creative ruts, finding new ideas and ways of working to drive us. Often the media and industry that surrounds artists is driven to try and slot them into particular genres or generations.
One of the things that she talks about, this girl who's talking to you, is about folk music and how many people think that, like, just because you play an acoustic guitar, that it's folk. Like, what's the difference?
Oh, most people think that, but folk is like a style, you know? Like, folk usually has, like, one point, and it's usually a moral, you know? Whereas, like, pop has a song can mean nothing or it can mean lots of things, and no one can be sure which ones they are.
All right.
So.
But you're more pop, right?
Oh, yeah, you know, yeah.
The desire to try new things and generally come at life with an experimental attitude is something that we're all born with. As adults though, there's often an impetus to rein these qualities in and leash ourselves to more stable ways that we can exist and identify ourselves. It's important then to remember this act of bringing that nature to turn up in your creative practice and allow yourself to be radical in the way that you experiment with new forms and new ways of working is an act of remembering that quality that you already had in the past. To me, the lesson that we can always remember here is never to resist if we have some kind of urge to move and try out a new genre or format for our creative work.
Part 3. Searching for space in the wrong direction.
Parisian writer and thinker Charles Baudelaire explored his own relationship between his ideas and his environment, using a concept he called the flaneur. Baudelaire spoke of his own poems and critical opinion stemming directly from walks he took through Paris, watching as the city changed with the coming of industrialization, and allowing his active state of observation to create a kind of engine for his thinking. But if we are going to try and step out and immerse ourselves in these new environments or journeys, then which kinds of paths should we be choosing to take? Here I want to talk about the idea of the anti-journey and the concept that, as an artist looking for new and original space of thoughts and perspective, we can actively choose to make journeys across our cities and environments that shirk the classic routes that would be chosen in order to see a more original, strange, or maybe even real sense of place.
This is where we found those books that time. Do you remember? You found that map of New York, and I found that notebook and those letters from that man to his wife telling her that she shouldn't abuse his family name.
The normal way of movement from station to airport to taxi to place of work can easily create a kind of altered or distanced relationship with other parts of reality.
When I first saw that, or first noticed it, I should say, a couple of years ago, I was absolutely astonished. I felt as if I was time travelling. I felt I was looking back into, the pre-World War I era. I could suddenly see the rural, if you like, shape of the land. Something that's just screened out by modern sensibility. It's a very powerful experience. It's kind of portal or window through to other possibilities that are embedded in the landscape.
Will Self is a writer who has taken this concept further than most. And in his fiction, such as The Book of Dave, we can easily see how his sense of land and possible formations of the city and culture are shaped by original ideas that come out of his own experience of travelling on foot. Self writes about these anti-journeys widely, like his walk from LAX to Hollywood, or when he left his house in South London, travelled on foot to Heathrow Airport, took a flight to JFK, New York, then continued walking into downtown Manhattan. To Self, the act of walking to the airport grounds the reality of stepping onto an international flight. This kind of international plane travel is a complete marvel, and any human before 1900 would have seen it probably as more surprising than we conceive of setting our own foot on the moon. But when we're taking more usual routes through underground terminals and smooth airport lounges, we're pushed to close down this sense of strangeness or miraculousness, pull the blinds down, put our headphones on and switch off. Going by foot, Self discusses, can allow the subject to reopen to the reality and strangeness of what they're actually taking part in.
It's a kind of engagement with the environment that is predicated on treating places and spaces as if they were a kind of repressed content that comes to the surface of your psyche.
My own trip was an attempt at a smaller version of this concept of the anti-journey. The general pull would have been to walk the Thames Path west towards Oxford, into more pastoral settings where I would have been expected and greeted by all the usual facilities. By going into the less walked and more industrial parts of the river's history, I do feel like I was able to have more of an unusual kind of trip and a more interesting kind of learning experience. I'm going to stop beating on about this here now, but I became quite interested in these ideas around anti-journeys and psychogeography when I was making this piece. So if you want to find some more discussion of this, I'm putting some more bits in the description below. And if you do end up getting more value from this video than expected, remember to drop that like and help YouTube know that it should send it to others.
Part 4. Where our protagonist comes home.
One of the most enjoyable parts of making this video was listening to the entirety of Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly through again. I remember when I first listened to this album a few times, and it was clear in my mind that no matter what kind of music fan you were, or art fan in general, when it came to forms of self-expression and complex ideas, this piece of work was a truly unique and standout example. Whatever I say about this album, it's going to be a simplification of what you can get from engaging with the artwork itself. But one of the stories Lamar explores is the journey of the artist leaving their home, finding knowledge on their travels, then coming back with the tools and insights of that new perspective.
For me, it's so much of a spiritual process in making the album. I gotta really feel connected to the music. I gotta feel connected to what I'm talking about. And that can drain you, you know, because you're pulling all these different emotions out. You're grabbing all these different experiences around the world and all these different conversation pieces. And you almost have to reenact that because you can't. The time I got inspiration, I probably was on the road. I didn't have no tour bus to record. So I gotta pull that energy back out.
Kendrick's own journey sees him having conversations overseas that allow him to turn around and recognize the illusion that sits within his own kind of American culture and the framework of ideology that surrounds it.
Going out there really inspired. I wrote a lot of records off the album just by visiting South Africa and being able to move around like I did. That was a turning point.
To Pimp a Butterfly points to a running theme between many of the artists we've spoken about today. Not only how leaving our safe harbours can promote powerful and original thinking, but how it can help to foster a strong sense of self and creative independence too. When artists are able to take that step, detach from the norms of their safer harbours, the illusions of those everyday bubbles become more clear, and the quality of the work and creative independence that it requires is put more strongly at the centre of that artist's identity than it was before. If you've enjoyed this piece, consider coming over and checking out the longer discussion of themes and the full-length travelogue video showing more of my own trip, which is over on the paid channels now. Thanks to all the paid supporters so far, on the Patreon shown here, and the Substack. I hope you recognise that I don't take that help lightly, and knowing yourself that it does matter. Thanks to everyone here for watching, peace in your work, and see you next time.